Okay, in the interest of time and respecting all of your time, we'll go ahead and get started. First, we'll do the normal administrative announcements. This is Barrick Abramson with Confluence, and this is the November 13th meeting of the Housing Subcommittee of the 1296 Task Force on the Rights of Coloradans with Disabilities. Members, if you're in a place where it's safe and comfortable to do so, we would love to have you on camera. We do understand that's not always the case. Members of the public joining or following the stream, if you jump over to the Zoom, we do have to you leave your cameras off until it's time for public comment. And on the note of public comment, if you would like to address the group, we'll have time at the end of our meeting. I would ask you, and this is the only time I will say use the chat, I will ask you to send a message via the chat to myself, Barrick Abramson, or my colleague, Carrie Steele, to let us know you'd like to speak to the group during public comment. Other than that, we try to refrain as much as possible from using the chat. It can be distracting for anybody who's joining and using a screen reader, or just from this group being able to focus on speaking with one another. So we try to do that as little as possible. With that, let me give a quick overview of our plans for today. I do apologize. There's a little last minute. You got this morning early the revisions of the ideas based on our last conversation. And Carrie and I went through all of the comments, all of the notes, went through the recording to make sure we were capturing everything that we heard. But we'll spend some time today to make sure that we did. And if we did, we'll go ahead and vote on those items. We do have the remainder of the items on the category of communications and data collection. Once we get through those, we'll move over to the data funding, permitting, oversight, and awareness. So we'll be driving through all of these. I do want to set expectations up front. Given how thoughtful the discussions were last time, and then what we got through was 7 ideas, we have about a dozen more to get through. Unless we just speed through all of those without having any discussion, we're going to need to find another block of time. So Carrie's going to reach out to folks. I do want to remind folks, we're on kind of a tight timeline. We are legislatively required to provide our recommendations to the executive committee on the 1st of December. The first falls on a Sunday, so we'll be delivering on Monday the 2nd. But I guess the Legislative Council either didn't look or didn't give much concern to the fact that that means coming out of Thanksgiving weekend, we've got to deliver our recommendations, which really gives us, after this week, 10 more days to get through all of that. Our intention is to give all of you at least a few days to look at the recommendations and the draft report before we finalize it and ship it off to them. All of this to say, we're going to need to look at time, ideally next week. If we need to, we can trail it into the following Monday, Tuesday to find another block of time. Carrie will reach out to you. We've heard from a few members who said if we need to do that, they'd rather do it early morning so it doesn't eat into already busy days, but we'll let all of you weigh in. As I said, we'll start going through all of the ideas. What I'm going to do is just highlight what are the ideas remaining in this first section around contract communications and data collection. And I'm going to bring those up because I want to make sure those are considered as we talk about the ones that have been revised. When I looked at everything from last time, with the exception of one that got revised, every other one was a revision combining several ideas, where you all thought about a different path forward based on the stakeholder input. That said, before I dive us into it, I do want to pause for just a minute, and I'm hoping that everybody has had a chance over the last 12, 14 days to dig into the stakeholder feedback, both from individuals who completed the survey, as well as from some of the agencies. And I want to just give anyone a moment who would like to offer your takeaways or your reactions or reflections on the feedback that we've received from stakeholders. Is there anybody who wants to speak to what you saw or read? I'm going to take silence as a no, so I will dive us into what I'm going to do is fairly quickly read the remaining of the ideas on this current section. I just want to make sure everybody is a little bit tuned into what those are, and then we're going to go back through these one by one, and then we will go back to the ones that have been revised. So we're starting, if anybody is following along on the Google Doc, and this is the one place where I will make an exception to our usual. I will drop the link in the chat if you'd like to follow along. I'm working directly in the version that has the stakeholder feedback in it, at least that from the survey. And we're starting off with idea number 8, which is on page 18. So let me just start briefly reading through these. Idea 8 is to establish within an appropriate division of state government an accessibility navigator position or office to provide technical assistance to property owners seeking to comply with requirements and meet greater standards of transparency of the availability of accessible housing. The office would also perform the roles in our previous idea, which just to roll back to that one, related to it requiring that jurisdictions include consideration of accessibility features in their processes, and we'll talk about the revisions there. Moving forward, and I know I'm going quickly, we're going to spend time on each. I just want to highlight what's ahead of us. The next idea, idea number 9, which is on page 20 of that Google document, establish a statewide process and requirement for an accessibility report by a licensed architect or engineer on all properties when they are bought, sold, or refinanced to confirm compliance with federal and state disability laws. The next idea, which is down on page 22, build on the information by directing the Colorado Disability Opportunity Office, CDO, to collaborate with the Department of Local Affairs and other state agencies to maximize the current and future collection of data to support the greatest available information about the inventory of accessible and adaptable housing, which includes features relating to other services, including those for the IDD community, as well as the aging caretakers community. Those are the ideas that remain on this section. And as I said, we'll go through each one of them one at a time, starting with idea number 8. And I do want to make sure that folks had a chance to look at the feedback that we got here. And it ranges from, you'll see at the beginning, this is the established with an appropriate division and accessibility navigator or office, provide technical assistance. This time is to property owners. You may recall 2 weeks ago, we talked about a navigator service or position for individual home seekers, individuals with disabilities. And where you all landed was, rather than restating a requirement that the state provide, the recommendation we'll be discussing, as you saw in what was sent out this morning, is around getting the state to partner with local actors and other nonprofits with the goal of getting to the place where every individual with a disability would have access to a navigator. This is about those in the housing side of it. Some people say, someone would to help would be good, but items need to be permitted. That will be adding costs and times. Some people said don't like establishing new offices. I'd suggest set standards and ask people to comply. Some say excellent idea and balances the requirements with the two sides. Someone says this is very needed. Technical assistance would be helpful. Now somebody says now there's 2 positions, one to help those in need and the other helping those providing the housing. But let me just pause there. I don't need to read all the feedback. I would love to just check in on where folks' thinking is in light of the stakeholder input and our last conversation on this one of creating within an office a navigator position or office to help the developers navigate. Who wants to go first before I start calling on you? Let me flip the question. Based on our last conversation and reading the stakeholder input, is there someone who believes that we should be pushing this this idea as a recommendation as is, or with some revisions? Rochelle.
May I ask a question first? This is Rochelle Mitchell, Northern Colorado. Comment number 25, is that true? And the comment states, sorry, I have to flip back to my other screen, that private consultants are readily available to assist property owners seeking to voluntarily comply with current or enhanced ADA standards. I'm
Your
not,
question is whether there are consultants or
but
whether
are there
people,
consultants readily available to assist owners in that way?
I don't have an answer for that. Paul?
Um, Paul Brady, God and Sudik. Yes, we hire consultants on a good percentage of our projects.
Thank you, Paul. To that effect, could we alter that to just state something that would promote or give promotion to in the plan of those types of consultants readily available, the resource being readily available?
I think we certainly could. Let me talk with all of you a little bit about what that could look like. We've talked in a number of other committees and in this one about the state, whether it's providing templates or model documents. We've talked about promoting best practices. Uh, I think we may run into some challenges in providing a directory of consultants because the state is very hesitant to get into the role of seeming to endorse any. Rochelle, would you envision instead of creating this new office, instead having something where we promote the use of or promote awareness of?
As long as we could direct folks some way to meet with their local whatever, or at least give some sort of resource directory without promoting individual businesses or consultants, I think that that would, as long as we can give some sort of informational direction.
So let me ask you, in one of the other ideas from last week, we ended up, instead of asking the state to take on a role, asking the state to partner with nonprofits and local entities to provide this service. Would that be a model you'd want to see here, or does that not fit?
I get real sticky about putting things back on the shoulders of nonprofit
Fair
agencies,
enough. Yep.
being one ourselves. It's a very heavy lift that we're asked to do already. And I don't have a listing of folks to give. I can hopefully direct them to like Denver Metro Fair Housing or something that would give them some sort of resource. But
Paul, your thoughts on this? Do we create something like a directory of resources who could direct folks? What's the best way to get at what this is trying to accomplish while addressing all of your concerns about, is this something we want to require the state to do?
One way I could see this working is kind of similar to the Excel Energy Design Assistance Program. And what that does is Excel offers a rebate to design teams to help pay for the energy modeling of a project, knowing that doing that up front likely results in less energy usage, so they don't have to, they get benefits on their end. So we could recommend or encourage that the state establish a rebate program that if a technical expert is hired on the project, maybe a portion of the plan review fees is rebated back to compensate for hiring that expert.
What do folks think of that?
One thought I'll add is I think those experts work really well if guides and legislation are already published. So we'll have them make sure we're complying with federal fair housing or the ADA. If there's statements in proposed legislation that, or I don't know, if we have guidelines to provide wayfinding or less established regulations, those third parties won't know how to enforce that. And a navigator at the state level, whatever, could maybe provide assistance in authoring those guidelines.
Tim?
Thanks. Tim Dolan, Inclusive Housing Coalition. A model for this might be Chaffa has a technical assistance program. It's called the Small Housing Innovation Program, technical assistance. They actually provide technical assistance to folks that are looking to do to build affordable housing properties that are too small for, say, a light tech execution. So there is a technical assistance or there's a model for a technical assistance program out there that utilizes other that is not is just managed by Chaffa, but the actual technical assistance is provided by outside subject matter experts. And so what they did was go out and I think maybe they did it with an RFP, was go out and seek subject matter experts that could provide this technical assistance, and then people apply to the Chaffa for the technical assistance. So if I think it could work in other realms, something, like something like this, that might just be a good model for it. Now, I'm not saying Chaffa needs to do it, but the state could follow that model or some other organization could follow that model. But the point is that it's not putting the onus um, on nonprofit agencies to provide any sort of technical assistance. It's placing on these people that get hired to do that. Now, in this case, Chaffa pays for the technical assistance. Now, I'm not saying that it needs to be free either, but that might be an incentive if there is a reason to do that. And I don't think it's terribly expensive.
What do folks think about this? Rather than creating an office in government that is providing this, instead created a hub that kind of gets at what Rochelle had floated of, can we connect people with the experts? But the state essentially managing a hub and identifying through an RFP or RFQ process some way of identifying the qualified individuals. Cassidy?
Cassidy Roberts from Disability Law Colorado. Yeah, I like that idea. I think a concern I have is definitely cost. And I don't want cost to be a deterrent for people using this service when they're trying to build affordable, accessible housing. So I would want that to be part of the program, whether it's rebate thing that Paul mentioned, or I know Tim mentioned Chaffa, pays for the program, that the technical assistance program that they have, but whether there's some sort of discount or something like that that just incentivizes people to use it, and it's less burdensome than putting the whole bill.
General consensus on this. Do folks want us to work together, work up some language to replace creating a new office with creating a program and a hub of technical assistance providers? So we're using the existing expertise rather than trying to recreate it within a state office, but the state could manage that hub. Paul?
Paul Brady again. Another thought. It's a federal program, but it's called Fair Housing Accessibility First.
Yeah.
I think that's similar to what we're describing, except it's at a federal level and it's focused on the Fair Housing Act. Maybe we could get a state-focused employee or, push the feds to give us state-focused help.
Why don't we look at all of these, the Chaffa program, the federal program, and weave in some language to bring back to you guys. Okay, I appreciate this conversation, and I have to tell you, this committee probably got more stakeholder comments than just about anybody. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to go through these. The next one is item 9 on page 20. Establish a statewide process and requirement for an accessibility report by a licensed architect or engineer on all properties when they are bought, sold, or refinanced to confirm compliance with federal and state disability laws. I won't opine on the comments. I'll give you all a minute to read them. If you'd like me to read any of them or read some highlights, let me know. I will also just read a comment we received from DOLA in conversation with the Division of Housing that says technical assistance is already available through DOLA and Chaffa for state grant funding to assist developers. We would be interested in understanding what additional assistance the subcommittee would like to see to assist with increasing the stock of accessible housing. We believe the idea of a centralized resource for involved stakeholders, including developers of for sale and for rent properties, architects, contractors, engineers, zoning authorities, and other local oversight entities to expand awareness and utilization could be accomplished through a Housing Colorado webinar. And I don't read that to give undue weight to it versus any other comment, but because DOLA and DOH wanted to call out some work that is already existing and offering a specific idea with that webinar. I wanted to share that and would welcome folks' reactions to the comments you see here, whether it's about architects and engineers, general unwillingness to opine on compliance, or I saw a number of comments in there wanting clarity in particular on what units we're talking about. But folks' thoughts on the feedback, on Dola's comment, or on where you might want to go with this idea? Let me, Paul, please.
I'd be in favor of modifying it to have some exemption for projects of a certain small size. You're muted.
Yep. Do you have thoughts on what that small size might look like? I know, in our previous ideas, we were talking about, buildings with more than 4 units. Are we talking about similar?
No, I think it'd be a higher threshold because there's some cost inherent in this.
And
I'd
we
just
don't
be
have to
picking a
decide
number,
that
though.
today.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you all can say above a certain threshold, and we can let exec committee and some subject matter experts fill that in. Is anybody compelled by Dola's comment or suggestion about what does exist and that some of this could be done through some Housing Colorado webinars? Cassidy.
Thank you. I'm wondering, can we return to like what the heart of this recommendation was? When I read it, I thought this came from a place of wanting to know or wanting to create more of a database of what is out there for accessible housing. So to that end, we would want every single dwelling unit, multifamily, single family, anything to kind of have this assessment. So then that would go to strengthen the data that we're collecting. So I don't know if I'm misinterpreting what our original goal was.
No, Cassidy, I'm glad you're bringing us back to that. And I can confirm that this came from a conversation about trying to understand what the inventory actually is. We had really 2 conversations or parallel pieces going back February, March, and April. One was, what is the specific need and demand when we look at different areas and different types of accessibility features? The other was, what is the actual inventory? And this was an idea that this group created and got some enthusiastic response from some members of the exec committee that this could be a way to gather more data. And I think it combines with the next idea, number 10 on page 22, which is to build on the information by directing CEDU to collaborate with DOLA and other agencies to maximize the current and future collection of data to support the greatest available information about that inventory. So this really was someone on this group, and if it was you, take credit, because I don't recall right now who it was, floated the idea of what if at sale we could capture that information about what those features are. Paul.
I thought there was also maybe some concern that existing properties don't meet the codes as is. And so this would maybe close some loopholes. There's some non-compliance issues.
I do. Cassie, I'm going to call on you next. Shelley's not with us, but she sent a note. But I want to read this because it actually speaks to this one. And her note says this isn't something that architects or engineers have historically been willing to do. It necessitates them assuming liability for what we all understand to be often ambiguous and occasionally conflicting legal requirements. California has a voluntary structure around accessibility certifications from state certified access specialists. In my experience, she says it remains difficult to find one of these people willing to handle residential projects. So that was just a note that Shelley wanted to share that fortuitously came in right as we were talking on this topic. Let me go to Cassidy and then Tim.
Yeah, thanks. I guess if our end is compliance, I think that begs the question of like who is enforcing this then? If, you know, someone comes in, they don't comply, maybe maybe there's a need for some sort of mechanism to enforce the disability rights laws that they're not in compliance with the building codes or whatever it is. So I would just add that. Gosh, I had another thought. It left me. I will raise my hand when it comes back.
Tim?
So I'm kind of late to the party on this one, but this reads to me like very much like a compliance kind of thing. And if that's the case, then okay, except that I mean the law is the law, so people have to follow the law. So is what we're trying to get at is that people are making sure that people are following the law, or are we trying to get information? And if it's that we want to make sure people are following the law, then perhaps the better way to do that is to task the enforcement agencies with making sure that people are following the law, although they're already doing that. If it's about getting information, then I would piggyback a little bit on what Shelley said, and maybe rather than have an architect or an engineer, maybe something that's more of a self-certification opportunity. But then what's the incentive for people to self-certify? Usually when people self-certify for something they're getting something out of it. They're self-certifying so that they get something out of it. But again, I'm not quite sure on what the intent here is. So
And
that's
all I can do, Tim, is reflect back from looking very quickly at my notes back to the discussion. And this was not about compliance. This item wasn't. We had other compliance discussions. This was about how can the state have a more comprehensive database and knowledge of what units exist where and what those features may be. And a member of this subcommittee said, well, what if at time of sale or refi, we could have this audit or this report done? It may have gotten a little formal as that conversation with, the certified architect or licensed architect or engineer. But the goal was to capture information, and rather than just going and doing a statewide audit of all properties, the suggestion was sale and refi seem like moments in time when inspections and other things are happening. Paul?
I can add that when we work for, I don't know, it's typical when a hedge fund or somebody is buying an apartment building that part of their disclosures or the docs they want to see is one of these reports, because they're not experts and they don't know if the property complies, and they don't want to assume a liability, and they don't trust that all the rules were followed. But if it were a certification, a voluntary certification, that would dovetail with that process, because those certifications are happening for that financial traction on those large scale projects, and the state could maybe expand that into other zones.
So let me ask, and I want to be very clear, as I throw out ideas, it's not me proposing them, it's me trying to pull the threads of a conversation together. I'm hearing a couple of things that maybe this is about a certification or a checklist, which is something, we've already got one idea having to deal with listings of properties, where you all, and we'll get to this in a minute, have talked about a checklist that those property owners would provide when they lease a property. Is this one where there is this voluntary provision of this type of checklist or certification of what exists? And I would just ask all of you how you might want to approach. Right now we have language about requiring, because the goal was to collect as much data as possible. With a voluntary process, other than incentives to get some people to do it, does that get at your goal, or do you need to require it as one of the documents for one of these transactions of certain size property or development in the state? Cassidy.
I personally like the idea of requiring it for the data collection's sake. If we did require it, then we would know that we're capturing the full picture. I'm wondering, this is a bit out of my wheelhouse, if there is someone maybe who is a little less specialized and expensive than an engineer or an architect who could go in with this sort of checklist and be able to certify properties. I don't really know if that would be possible. I think maybe it could be trickier with, saying this is a type A based on what the International Building Code says. That seems to me like an architect is probably needed, but as far as just looking for features and certifying that they're there, I'm wondering if we could make this not as onerous and expensive of a process for these homeowners.
Let me,
To complete. Yeah, go ahead.
so just reflecting on that, a couple of thoughts for this group. One, I don't want you all to get bound up thinking that you have to identify who the individual is. We can get the exec committee, we can get ledge council, or we can get the regulatory body, whether that ends up being DORA or DOH, responsible for sorting that out. I think a question that you all do need to sort through is whether this needs to be, for lack of a better term, an appropriately qualified individual, whether that's a specific license or not, but somebody with certain qualifications, or if you're willing to have this be somebody, and it could be the property owner or developer, could self-certify. Again, if the goal of this is still about the data collection, do you add the burden of somebody needing to have formal credentials to do that?
I guess I would lean towards a self-certification because I think, and I'll lean on Paul for this, but I think it's not very likely that, you're going to be able to ask an engineer or an architect, in my experience anyway, if you ask them to do something, they're going to want to, give you a very good, thorough, professional review. So it might be difficult to get something that's sort of surface. And that's why I would be more, if it's just about getting data and not necessarily ensuring that something is happening, then I would be more in favor of a self-certification.
Paul, you got name checked on that? Your thoughts, and then Cassidy.
I guess I'll provide context to what the reports I've seen. They're very specific, like Tim's suggesting. For instance, the shower door opens 87 degrees and not the full 90 degrees, or the shower's a quarter of an inch out of square. The self-certification, and this might just be fear that they've instilled in us architects, but a lot of these accessibility laws, they're enforced through litigation, and it's like a civil rights violation if you don't comply. And so if somebody were to self-certify, they would assume that risk of lawsuit. So I think that legal risk alone is enough that we could probably leave it vague, because there'd only be certain people that would, I think, take that upon themselves.
Cassidy, your thoughts, and then I'm going to read you guys a piece where we've talked about a checklist and another idea.
Yeah, my thought is essentially what Paul touched on. I'm concerned that if someone is not following the law, they're not going to self-certify that they are not following the law, because that creates liability, and that is an admission, essentially. So I have concerns with that.
So we're going to vote on this next one in a little bit, but let me read you some language that we're working on another one. And this had to do with listings of units. And the idea that came up when we talked 2 weeks ago was about creating a checklist. So here it was that through a collaboration of experts and lived experience, create a checklist of accessibility features available in properties, available in this case for lease, and explore the most feasible way to roll out that checklist. Is there a version of that that would make sense here that, the point was just made that you get into such nuanced specifics about the 45 or the 90 degree, how far does the door open? Would it make sense for this, whether it's self-certified or the option to self-certify or use an appropriately qualified individual, that the state develop in partnership with these other experts that checklist of what should be examined as part of that? Seeing a nod from Cassidy. Other thoughts on that? Should we, again, I want to pull it to what we were trying to accomplish, and let's, pull back up to the ultimate level. We're trying to, one, expand the number of accessible and affordable units on market, grow the inventory. As part of this, we need to know what units exist and where. If the goal of this is to collect data, do we want to shift this from establishing the statewide process and requirement for a licensed architect or engineer to instead requiring a process to submit this information on a checklist that's developed of these features? Tim? I don't know if you were looking to talk or you came off mute for a second there.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I guess in my mind, I'm thinking if it's about collection of data, can we combine it with number 10 and that directs CDU to, essentially collect data. So I'm sure they're going to have to, being a new agency, they're going to have to find ways to do that. And if that's the case, then maybe they can determine the rules of how that gets done.
Interesting idea. The one thing that I will offer, and I will never weigh in on your ideas or not, CDU is a brand new office where it's going to have very limited resources. So I will just throw out for your consideration, you may want your recommendation to be to direct an appropriate office or state agency. And that could end up being CDU. I'm a little reluctant to encourage you to put forward a recommendation that is fully tethered to one office.
That totally makes sense to me. I guess the point I was trying to make there is that if this is, why have two separate kind of recommendations about collecting data? If it's about collecting data, then we could probably combine.
But Rochelle, I'm going to come to you and with the thought you have in mind, and also I will ask you and others thoughts about combining 10 and 9. And 10 really, I think, would be the front of it. And we would say within, have an appropriate office, maximize the collection of data, including exploring this statewide system of capturing data at time of sale or refi. But I don't want to lose whatever was on your mind, Rochelle.
And I would start that off with, yes, I would be in support of combining 9 and 10. I think we are with the goal of being some sort of inventory or scoring system, like a lead, gold, silver, bronze star system of what could be accessible or visitable. But I would be really careful with saying any state agency. I don't want HICPUF to determine whether or not a residency is accessible or not. They're just, yeah. Nothing should be given to HICPUF, but so either the Office of Independent Living or the CDU office. Those are about the only two offices that I would say are at the best interest of people with disabilities upholding the ADA.
Oh,
I'm good with all those additions. Number 10. I guess me personally, I saw number 9 as a way to assure. And so I like them being separate for that reason. But I do like it being voluntary, kind of that voluntary certification.
why don't we do this? Why don't Carrie and I work on language that combines these, but leaves the option of separating them back out when you all look at the language. But the basic idea would be to identify, to Rochelle's point, an appropriate state office with the requisite knowledge and expertise of the needs of this community, and that one of the tools would be this voluntary collection of the data. Does that approach sound good? That we combine them, but leave kind of a line between where we could separate when we get back together, if you'd like? Okay. Then I am going to move us along. That concludes that one, which means I'm going to move us back to what are now our revised ideas. These I'm hoping we can fairly quickly go to votes on these. I will, again, whether you call it me breaking my rules or me making an exception to my own rules, I'm going to drop in the chat in case anybody doesn't have the email handy, the ideas that came from our last discussion. So we had two ideas, idea 1 and 2. One was about requiring all documents to be in plain language. The other was about directing DOH and CDU or others as appropriate to develop guidance. You all hesitated a little bit about defining what is best practice, what we want to require. We had some comments back about were we adding costs or excessively undermining legal language by going too plain. The group had recommended really looking at what is going on, where are some good examples. So the combined idea reads as follows: establish a working group to examine practices in place in the private and government sectors relating to the accessibility of housing and related contracts and publications to determine the feasibility of plain language use and other practices to improve accessibility and the securing accessible affordable housing. The group should include property owners, developers, with individuals with disabilities, and legal experts, and be convened by DOLA and DOH, CDU, or another appropriate state agency or office. So let me first just get reactions to how this looks as the combination of our conversation 2 weeks ago. Tim.
Tim Dolan, Inclusive Housing Coalition. So I don't want to parse this too much, but I'm wondering if my recollection of the conversation seems to be that everybody sort of felt that plain language would be a good idea. So I'm not sure it's necessarily about feasibility. It seemed to be, the gray area really seemed to be, where is it practical to use it and where is it not practical to use it? And so I'm wondering if that could maybe be the focus, that, this committee determines that plain language could be beneficial to folks with disabilities. But we also recognize that there's places where it's practical and there's places where it's not so practical, like in legal documents. And so maybe that's the focus of the working group. Not necessarily is it feasible to use plain language, but we know that it's feasible to use plain language. How's it practical? I know that that's just probably wordsmithing, but
No, it's helpful. And obviously, look, what we want to do is get this where you all feel good about this. Understanding the exec committee is going to wordsmith it even further, but I've just, in response, edited to say to determine the practicality in different scenarios or documents of plain language. Would that get closer, Tim?
yeah, for sure. What I'm just trying to get there is that I don't want there to be any idea that we don't think it's a good idea to utilize plain language,
Yeah.
but we know that you can't just make it all plain language. There's got to be some practicality concerns.
Yeah, understood. Rochelle?
Yeah, there's some new definitions and brought out from the 504 letter that came out in October that talks about reasonable and effective communication requirements, just using that language that communication with individuals with speech, hearing, and vision disabilities are as effective as communication with others. That language alone is in the ACL, or it's in the 504 new definitions that I said just came out. So if we just can point to that, that's a federal law requirement now, but with a better definition is what we are being told.
I apologize. I'm just making notes while we're going through this. And Rochelle, I'm sorry, that's 504, right?
Yes, correct, 504.
Okay, so I just added that the group should incorporate the October 2024 guidance on 504 for effective communication in its work. Does that, Rochelle, does that get to that for you?
Sorry, I was on the other page with that to unmute myself. I don't know if you need to put October because I think the definitions came out prior to that. Association for Community Living gave their expanded fact sheet in October. So I'm not exactly sure when I think the definitions actually came out earlier in like June or something like that.
Okay.
Safe to say 2024.
Yep, that's where I'm going with in it. So we're adding that the group should incorporate those 2024 definitions, and further that the group should include these different stakeholders of property owners, developers, individuals with disabilities, legal experts, and be convened by an appropriate state agency. Is this one that folks are ready to now vote on? Okay, seeing some nods and no objections, we'll go to a roll call vote on this. Tim Dolan.
Yes, I, whatever the thumbs up is.
Either of those are just fine. Cassidy,
Yes.
Paul,
Yes.
Rochelle,
Aye.
Brian.
Yes.
Thank you all. Okay. Our next again combines two ideas. Idea 3 originally was to direct DOH to establish a position or office with at least one full-time employee to assist individuals with disabilities navigating the markets. Idea 4 was consider state grants to nonprofits, community orgs, or local housing authorities for programs to provide these similar services. In talking through that, you all wanted to focus on what the real goal was of this, which was the accessibility of a navigator. And so the revised version combines those two as follows. with the goal of creating a system where every Coloradan with a disability has access to a navigator and or a system of navigation supports. Establish partnerships between the Division of Housing, nonprofits, and local entities to provide educational and navigational supports. As a first step, convene all interested parties to develop a needs assessment and work plan, including potential funding needs at multiple levels of supports and grants. Let me get reactions to the combination, and in addition to the combination, how you feel about this idea based on our last set of conversation. Cassidy, please.
I'm wondering if we need the needs assessment as part of the first step. I don't really recall this conversation too much, but I do know, I mean, this is just a big issue. And there is need, and I think the need is recognized. So I'd maybe be in favor of mixing that, and unless other people have strong opinions about that.
No, Cassidy, as I recall the conversation, and needs assessment may have been my awkward wording. I think folks wanted to do, maybe a better word would be a heat map or an inventory of what does exist.
Gotcha, okay. So more of an assessment of what's already out there, and then determining how to fill the gaps kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just changing to an assessment of existing program, assessment and inventory of existing programs.
That's awesome.
Tim.
This is Tim Dolan from Inclusive Housing Coalition. So am I recalling correctly that DOH's or DOLA's concern on number 3 was tasking one person to do what this calls for wasn't feasible? Am I right on that, or?
Yeah, let me read you their comments on both of these ideas.
Okay.
The idea 3 and 4. On I3, they said, this type of statewide effort would require significant resources and personnel to implement. There may be other state agencies that may have navigators or ombudsman services already, in which this could be explored in greater detail. Organizations at the local level may be better equipped to provide this type of service. We also partner with CHAFA and other orgs such as Housing Colorado that may be able to coordinate with us on creating webinars for such information. And on the idea of giving grants to nonprofits and other orgs, DOLA said providing grants or loans to nonprofits, community orgs, or local housing could be considered through existing competitive programs. As resources are limited in smaller areas, a more regionalized approach could be explored as to maximize resources available.
Yeah, and that's what I thought. I guess with this wording, what I think may be missing is the identification of a potential lead partner. It says the partnership, but somebody's got to, and maybe it's not the person that we end up saying, but I guess somebody needs to be maybe it's just enough to say somebody needs to be a lead organization, whoever that is, whether it's, an agency of government or whether it's another organization. But it might
what
be
if I added at the end that a first or an early step of the group should be to identify lead partner?
I think that covers it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a little bit of that is implied, but it's good to get explicit about it. If Division of Housing is the only one called out in terms of a state agency, statute can only really direct a state agency to do something, not the rest of the partners. But I like that addition just to make it clear that somebody needs to lead.
Any other comments before we go to a vote on this one? Okay, in the interest of mixing it up, I'll go backwards in the list. And Brian, I'm not calling you backwards. I'm just starting at the bottom of my list. Brian Rossberg.
Yes.
Thank you. Rochelle.
Yes.
Paul.
Yes.
Cassidy.
Yes.
Tim.
Yes.
Thank you all. By unanimous vote, this combined idea will go forward as a recommendation. Our next one is the final combination. Idea 5, this related to getting information about properties leased or being leased to be available. Idea 5 was require any publication or other advertisement for a property available for lease that lists any features of the unit or property to list all accessibility features, which should include, but not be limited to, counter heights, grab bars, outdoor and garage available accessible parking spots, number of elevators, and which common building amenities are accessible, such as pools, common areas, etc. Item 6 was intersecting with this, and that was to require any multi-unit property to list the number of available Type A units, Type B units, Type C units, units with accessibility related communication features, and units with roll-in showers. And just to refresh on some of the discussion on that first one, there were questions about, is everybody going to be listing different features? How do we kind of standardize that? And that led to the conversation about a checklist. On idea 6 about listing the number of Type A, Type B, Type C units, several of you said, if we're really trying to make this accessible, stop talking in jargon and talk about what we really are identifying in these different units, what that means. So the combined revision draft reads as follows. Through a collaboration of housing experts and the disability community, create a checklist of accessibility features available in properties available for lease, and to explore the most feasible ways to roll out the checklist. Further task the group with developing standards for inclusion of information about the number, type, and specific features of units in multi-unit buildings where a single individual or entity owns more than 4 units. The stated goal in creating such collaboration should be to reach a rental housing market in which all online or printed for rent listings of property in a building with more than 4 units includes the information in the checklist created and details about the number of units with accessibility features, including the details of those features. Thoughts and feedback on the revised combination of these? Right, please.
So Brian with Housing Colorado. I'm just thinking in terms of like enforcement of who, if there's listings that need, if there's some sort of requirement down the road, and I guess losing a little bit of that between combining these two of, requiring listings to list all these features. I guess, do we need to have a little bit of, if there is this requirement, like who's enforcing the requirement? I guess going back a little bit to Tim on the last one, having somebody, a lead agency, if there's going to be a requirement, who's going to enforce that requirement?
And so let me open this to the group. We had an interesting conversation on another subcommittee call about, hey, who enforces all of these requirements of the ADA and CADA? And it brought silence, frankly, even with a lot of experts on the call and at our call. And ultimately, the answer was there isn't proactive enforcement on a lot of these things. It's up to the aggrieved party to pursue their rights under CADA or the ADA, which may start at CCRD or elsewhere. So a question for all of you is, do you want to state that someone is responsible for enforcing, or leave it to the individual to pursue their rights with something like a legislative declaration that inclusion of this is considered a civil right issue? If you want to say that there should be a state agency responsible for enforcing this, or a local agency, if you want to delegate it to locals, do you want to name who that should be, or do you want to put your recommendation forward that there should be someone identified to enforce this at the state and or local level? So I guess two-part question. Do you want to make somebody in charge of enforcing it, or leave it to anybody who finds that this wasn't done to seek their remedy?
I think I'm okay with that enforcement. Who's there to say we're advertising the right size of the unit?
So when you say you're okay, you think we should include in the recommendation that there should be a designated.
I don't think there needs to be a
You
designated
don't think
enforcer.
okay. Thank you. I appreciate you clarifying. Others. Tim.
Doesn't have to do with the enforcement, although I think that's still an open question. But I'm wondering, as I hear it, I'm wondering, we say 4 or more units, but if folks with less than 4 units want to include it, maybe we should say that they're invited to do that as well. I wouldn't want them to not do it just because they're not 4 more units. If they want to do it of their own volition, I think that's great.
And just for clarification, the language was more than 4 units, which was proposed in our last conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Minute, but I want to be clear on it. Cassidy.
I think, yeah, to track the Fair Housing Act and COTA, I think it's actually 4 or more. So 3, if you have 3, you don't have to, your COTA and the Fair Housing Act don't apply to you, but if you have 4 or more, then you are subject to those laws. So I think our intent was to at least track those.
Thank you.
I will say the caveat to that is for advertisement. So the advertising provisions of COTA and the Fair Housing Act apply regardless of how many units you own. You can't have a discriminatory advertisement. If this does get baked into COTA, this would likely fall under the advertisement provision and would apply to everyone, just for everyone's knowledge. It wouldn't be, 4 or more.
So with a note added, 1, I've adjusted it to more than 4 units. We're saying 4 or more units, we're saying, correct? Okay. And a note at the end that owners of properties with fewer than 4 units should also be invited and encouraged to provide the same information. With that, any further discussion before we go to a vote on this combined idea of 5 and 6? Okay. Tim.
Yes.
Cassidy.
Yes.
Paul.
Yes, sorry.
Thanks. Rochelle.
Yes.
Brian.
Yes.
By unanimous vote, this combined idea, as revised during our conversation and the edits in real time online, will go forward as a recommendation. We have one last revision, and then we're going to shift gears entirely. The original idea was require that all jurisdictions include consideration of accessibility features in development, approval, and building permit applications. And my notes and review of the conversation was really that you all said, let's start by encouraging them to have the conversation. You all heard some of the feedback or read it with people having concerns that they expressed about adding unnecessary burdens or costs to the process. There were also people, for full transparency, that said, yes, you should do this exactly this way. The conversation among the subcommittee 2 weeks ago led to, let's encourage these conversations to take place, and let's provide some guidance to local officials on how to do so. So we end up with a revised idea to provide resources to and direct the Division of Housing in partnership with Division of Local Government and organizations representing local governments. You all had cited CML, CCI, and Metro Caucus, developers, and the disability community to develop a guide for local governments with topics to consider in land use, building permits, and development approvals relating to expanding the inventory of affordable, accessible housing for individuals with a disability. Reactions and thoughts to this revision to, instead of moving from requiring they include it in their process, to instead provide, as you all discussed last time, guidance to them on how to include these conversations. Tim.
Yeah, my only thought on this is there are, I think both DOH and DLG do, sort of local, for lack of a better term, I want to call them, informational sessions or boot camps or something. So to make it sort of a little more voluntary or palatable, maybe it's following that sort of example of the local government folks in various regions of the state working with developers to offer this, informational sessions. I'm not sure how you put that into words there, but I'm just from conceptually, I'm thinking maybe there's already a model.
And I think, we did hear from DOLA that they do some similar things to this. So we could encourage them to incorporate this into other ongoing efforts to provide guidance and information to local leaders. I'm just adding encourage DOH and DLG to incorporate this guide and information into their existing and future efforts. Okay. Hearing no further discussion, although you're welcome to interrupt if you've got some. Otherwise, I'm going to go to a vote on this and then move us on to our next set of ideas. So for this idea, Tim Dolan.
Yes.
Cassidy Roberts.
Yes.
Paul Brady.
Yes.
Rochelle Mitchell.
Yes.
And Brian Rosberg.
Yes.
Thank you all by unanimous vote. This one will move forward as revised during our conversation. We are now going to radically shift gears. It is 12:39. This next section, full transparency, has 12 different items. We're going to get through a couple of these. I don't want to cut the conversation short, but I'll let you all move us along as quickly as you would like to or not. This is our ideas relating to data, funding, permitting, oversight, and awareness. The first one, direct CDU to collaborate with the Department of Revenue, Department of Local Affairs, and other state agencies to maximize the current and future collection of data to support the greatest available information about the inventory of accessible and adaptable housing. Additionally, the state should sync with and build on the data gathered by the U.S. Census Bureau and with the American Community Survey, identifying the percent of households with disabilities broken out by the number of units in the structure, the year the structure was built, the type of disability, and the county. The feedback in general was to what end? One says this sounds great in theory. However, in the foster care home setting, it is not relevant to the data needed for the disabled community. One person says this is important, but I would prioritize policy and program change and getting people into housing over data collection and needs assessment. I will also ask all of you if this is one, thinking back to where we were 15 minutes ago, that should get incorporated into that data collection where we were combining two ideas. I am dropping this document link in the chat for anybody who doesn't have it. But previously we looked at combining several ideas around data collection. So I want to leave it open to all of you of, should this be a standalone that we deliberate, or should we deliberate it and think about combining it with the ideas that we finished our data funding, permitting, or excuse me, our contracts and communications discussion with? Let me start at the top of that. Should this be a standalone, or should we explore this in parallel with the other ideas you all discussed on collecting data?
So Tim Dolan, I see. So just in general, I would be in favor of combining so that all the data recommendations are is really coming out of kind of one recommendation. Or one recommendation is data, and perhaps there's a way to make sub bullet points to that to say, and these are the kind of ideas about it. But the catch-all is data. Now, maybe it's different recommendations under one section. Just the reason the where I'm going with that is that I just don't want them to be piecemeal all over the place with regard to data, because this one again, we just had the discussion about CDU, and here we are saying CDU should be doing this, right? So maybe that's changed to an appropriate state agency or whatever that is. So um, just my inclination is combining them. I can certainly see where it might be beneficial to have them separate, but at the very least, I would want them to be congruent with each other so that we're not piecemeal all over the place. And just while I got the floor, I just might add, just with regard, I kind of agree with a couple of these comments in there. It might just be worth putting in there. Um, Something that's a little bit more affirmative on why we're collecting the data, which seems to me would be to um, set a baseline, number one, and then number two, to use that information to inform future legislation or decisions or whatever. If that's
Appreciate
in fact what it's you, I assume that's what it's used for. If that's not in fact what it's used for, then please say something else. But just in terms of satisfying those kind of questions, I think that's a valid question to say to what end to answer that.
Yeah, and I think we can do that. That was my, my side notes is this was about that assembling that information. I'm going to go to Paul next. I also want to call out for those of you on this document, right below that, item 2 is require the state of Colorado to conduct an analysis of any system service survey or other instrument of assessing housing features and housing needs to ensure the inclusion of the accessibility features and needs of properties and individuals by zip code, city, county, or other identifier. And I'm reading that because it does seem to all intersect with this data collection that Tim was just speaking to. Paul, let me go to you.
Um, I think this question being separate is important.
Okay.
I guess in context of conversations like a year and a half ago on this topic, there was a lot of people saying the 2% type A units I already provide aren't occupied by people with disabilities, and they disagreed with the need to provide 10 or 12%. And so I think it's a framing data of how much accessible inventory do we need to provide and for what populations.
So what if we, in our report, have a category of recommendations that is data and information? And within that, we have our previously combined items 9 and 10, but we have this as a separate item, but all under this category of actions to improve data collection and information.
Works for me.
And what are folks' thoughts on this item 2 here on page 1 of requiring the state to connect the analysis of all of these surveys and other instruments of assessing features? Do we want to keep this, and do we keep it in this data gathering, or does this separate itself a little bit? Paul?
I guess I'd just like to put emphasis on the different type of disabilities, because right now we really only have mobility and vision and hearing, and I think we're expanding that, but understanding what menu,
Yeah.
So
Understood. Okay, rather than trying to rewrite while we've got each other, on screen, we will revise these after today. But on 1, we're going to create a master category of data and recommendations. 9 and 10 from the previous survey will be combined. Item 1 from this survey on data, funding, permitting, oversight, and awareness will be a sub item under our data and information category. But we will also ensure the congruity of the language and include clarification of why we're collecting the data. And in each of these, we'll put some language with emphasis on the different types of disabilities that we need to collect the information and service. The next one, I'm going to ask what may seem like an obvious question, but I'm not here to insert my conclusions. The next one is publish the data referenced above and maximize awareness of it among housing authorities, government bodies, developers, and organizations supporting individuals with disabilities. I guess first question, would everyone agree with moving this forward and that it's part of our data and information awareness category? I'm not going to ask you to vote on this one because it really isn't a complex system issue and needs to be integrated with the others. So we'll incorporate it into a next iteration of our category on this. Next idea shifts a little bit to education, which you may recall going back to February, March. This was a big topic of our discussions of needing to better inform people in the developer side about what the needs are. So this idea is to direct an appropriate agency to develop or contract to have developed and make available education materials targeting developers about accessibility needs, features, and best practices. Feedback was this could be helpful. This could be helpful for new development. It would be impactful, but co-leadership and paid co-leadership is needed with disabled individuals and not only make available, but provide some incentive for. Let's talk about the idea itself of directing an agency to develop or contract with a party to establish to create these educational materials for developers. Is that needed, and is that a recommendation you guys want to put forward? I'm seeing a nod from Cassidy, I think. Tim.
So I always think more information is better. So I think that's great. I just would offer that a few years ago, Chaffa, DOH, and Enterprise, I think, created a developer's guide that is this very sort of interactive developer's guide that sort of goes soup to nuts on for multifamily development. So it might be worthwhile to look at that and see if you could add on to that already existing developer's guide. And that lives on Chaffa's website, I think.
Other thoughts, Cassidy?
Yeah, I think my only adjustment based on just the feedback we got here is ensuring we are consulting with people with lived experience and making sure that they are a part of this process. So I think we should move that.
Great. Tim?
Hey, I would just add, just to Cassidy's point, which is a great point. There is a section in the developer's guide on community engagement. So maybe if something is added on, there could also be something that talks about community engagement with folks with lived experience. I think the community engagement part of the existing developer guide is more like neighbors. But to bring in people with lived experience, I think is a very good idea.
Right. All right. We will work to revise this just a little bit, but it sounds like everybody agrees this is a good idea, but let's look at how we might be able to integrate this with the guide that's currently hosted by Chaffa and to make sure that we are incorporating or including individuals with disabilities and advocacy groups in the development process, as well as tagging onto that community development section. We don't have anybody who's requested public comment, so I'm going to take us to one more idea for today, and we'll see if we get through it or not. Item 5 at the bottom of page 2 reads, direct Chaffa to explore all possible levers of action, including modification to the QAP to provide targeted incentives for developing accessible units. Some of the comments are a question of who's paying for this revamp. Not a bad idea, but could be expensive. Some says this appears to only be targeted to new developments. What additional resources for host homes? not to be host home agencies. It should be available to the host home providers. I'll have to ask any of you if you can offer some guidance to the group on that comment. Someone says this could be extremely impactful, but I would add required adherence to 504 accessibility should be a threshold requirement for all projects. This person says replace universal design and accessible units with a standard accessibility code and guidance. Prioritize projects that build units beyond minimum accessibility requirements. So this one gets into more of how that QAP weighting could be adjusted. I will also flag what we had someone raise the question, and I don't see it in here, so it must be in another, about whether CHAFA can be directed to do something or whether we need to ask of them or find another way. And I don't know the answer to that. We'll have to consult with legal. But what are folks' thoughts on this idea that this goes back to several conversations, January, February, when we were talking about the QAPs as one lever the state does have and what's very few levers to address the financing side of expanding the inventory of accessible and affordable housing. Yeah, right.
Raise my hand. Sorry, just doing it
No, but
the old-fashioned way. Yeah, I think I was probably the one who raised the issue about directing CHAFA to do anything. It gets a little sticky, and setting precedent to direct them to change the QAP like gets a little tricky in a lot of ways. I think, in encouraging, if we're making a recommendation in terms of like what comes out of the executive committee, like encouraging CHAFA to take a look at these things, and even with that third comment there, I think that there's some good meat in there around like what are some things that could be considered by the QA, that CHAFA could consider in the QAP. I think one of the checks on the QAP process that is in place that is helpful is that the governor does sign off on the QAP. The governor has to sign off on that. So, by making a recommendation, perhaps that's more in the encourage and not require realm. It's at least documented and that is out in the ether. And with the governor's kind of check on that, you get a little bit away from that precedent of legislating the QAP, which gets there, yeah, it gets sticky. So yeah, that's my thought.
understood. Tim.
So I agree with everything Brian just said. And I would add that maybe maybe the recommendation here is that CHAFA does have a tax credit advisory group made up of stakeholders, mostly developers, and they also have a QAP working group. And so maybe a recommendation is to ask CHAFA to allow at least one person from the disability community to participate on each of those committees. And the practical side of that is that gives somebody a seat at the table, and that's probably a more effective way to incorporate things into the QAP, or at least have them heard, as opposed to having, as Brian pointed out, trying to direct somebody where it's really not appropriate for them to be directed, since they are an independent agency. So that would be my thought. And then just it focuses very hard, heavy on the QAP, and there was there are a lot of other resources at CHAFA that could be utilized, including single family housing, which may or may not be super applicable for host homes, but they might be. So I wouldn't get super specific. I would just say, consider CHAFA utilizing or having discussions about all of their programs for accessible housing. Those are my thoughts.
I'm just making some notes here. So I don't want to rush it, but I'm going to read it off to all of you and ask if you would like to vote on this, if you'd like to come back next time. As currently revised, this would say, encourage CHAFA to explore all possible levers of action, including modifications to the QAPs, provide targeted incentives for developing accessible units, further encourage CHAFA to explore all levers and programs that could be utilized to expand the inventory of affordable, accessible housing, ask CHAFA to invite members of the disability community to serve on their tax credit advisory group and QAP working groups. Is there discussion on this, or should we go to a vote? And I don't want anyone to feel rushed on it. Tim?
I'm just gonna, it's a super small thing here, but I might suggest that rather than say explore, change that to apply all possible levers, because they know what the levers are. So it's not about exploring it as much as it is apply. That's in like the first sentence. Yeah.
Gotcha. Any others? Well, then we will use our last 2 minutes to vote on this one. Brian Rosberg.
Yes.
Rochelle.
Yes.
Paul.
Yes.
Cassidy.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. That one passes unanimously. We do have items 6 through 12 remaining, and a couple of that we will be revising based on today's conversation. I know you have all given extensively to this work, but I do need to ask if we can get one more meeting with you. Carrie will reach out to all of you within the next 24 hours to find a time over the next 10 days. We'll try to find a way to do it outside of commitments that you all have, and I'm happy to work with you to take input if you can't attend the full meeting. But with that, I want to thank you all for a super productive conversation and set of votes today. We'll reach out over the next 24 hours, knock the rest of these out, and we'll talk a little bit about what the process is going to be with the report and the executive committee. But at 1 o'clock, I want to thank you all, and I will speak with you all here in the next 10 to 12 days. Thank you all very much.